So perfectionism often stems from our parents criticizing us constantly and being put down. Whenever it's like we weren't allowed to make a mistake. So therefore we internalize that voice or those voices. A warm welcome to you all today. We are talking about managing anxiety and panic attacks. Now, I'm not just going to talk about panic attacks or anxiety in a general sense, in a generic sense. I'm going to talk about it specifically regards to trauma and especially childhood trauma. So our mission today is to explore how trauma can cause anxiety and panic attacks in the first place. Then we're going to explore the concept of the inner child, and then we're going to start the process of looking at how to heal from past trauma, specifically related to anxiety. Now, I wanted to start with a quote from the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung. You may have heard of him. So he says, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." He says, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul." And then he also says, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." I thought I'd start with those quotes because you all have come here today to kind of address and, in one sense, face your demons, face that darkness. So I just wanted to kind of applaud you. And as Carl Jung has said there, that unless we actually bring light to the darkness that's within us, we won't actually advance. We won't come to consciousness. And sometimes doing that is painful because most of us are tuned, most of us are wired to avoid pain, isn't it? The in one sense, the whole system, the whole society that we have today encourages like comforts. Even nowadays we have the lights. Alexa, switch on the lights. We don't even have to get up off our sofa to switch the lights on. Like we live in such a world of comfort, but that can also be detrimental to our progress or our healing. And specifically here, when we talk about healing and almost going into the darkness within us, that is necessary in order to reconnect with ourselves, in order to develop a better relationship with ourselves. And that forms the foundation of better relationships with others and also the world. So it's really important what you're doing. It's really brave what you're doing. So I congratulate you for being on this session. So let's look at what is anxiety. Anxiety is a response to pressure, stress, or danger characterized by feelings of worry, fear, or unease that can range from mild to severe. So I'm sure all of you kind of know or have experienced what anxiety is like, especially if you've ever tried to achieve something big, you will go through anxiety. Some of the physical symptoms of anxiety are a fast pounding of the heart, sweating, trembling or shaking of the body, shortness of breath, or hyperventilating. It's also to do with panic attacks, dizziness or lightheadedness, nausea or stomach upset, or even your stomach does flip-flops, need to run to the toilet sometimes. And then there is muscle tension. So again, if any of you have tried to achieve something, if you've ever gone for a job interview or something where you are under pressure, naturally we will have some of these symptoms. However, today what I want to explore is not just the general anxiety that happens, shall we say, to everyday people. What I want to explore is specifically the connection between childhood trauma or even any kind of big T trauma and how it's linked to anxiety. So this is not just a normal anxiety that happens. This is specifically rooted in trauma. So that's what I'm going to be exploring today. So big T trauma, what is that? So that's something that is very traumatic. It's generally something very physical, For example, a serious car accident. Sometimes a person is hospitalized, sometimes paralyzed. I have one uncle, and he was in a serious car accident and he was paralyzed. Sometimes it may be something like physical abuse, for example, being attacked at school. Sometimes it may be something like sexual abuse, especially when we're young and we are easily manipulated. It could be something like violent verbal abuse. So this is where somebody is maybe calling us or was calling us names, especially when we were young or as a child. But it was a very aggressive tone. It was very aggressive. It was very like loud, violent almost. So I use the term violent there to mean like loud, and it's almost like physically attacking. Now, what makes it into trauma is that the emotional response within us is very intense. So in other words, it has a very strong impact on the brain. And that's why we call it trauma. So this is a diagram of the mind. The top bit there is the conscious mind and the lower bit is the subconscious mind. So when a traumatic event happens, the memory of that event gets stored in the subconscious. But what's also interesting is there is an associated emotional response that also gets stored in the subconscious mind. And it's this associated, very strong, very intense emotional response that is often the root cause of the what we experience later, and especially anxiety, but it could be any emotion. But specifically today, we're going to talk about anxiety and the emotions associated with that. So what you can see here, what I've tried to depict, is the incident itself. So the memory of that incident and the emotion almost get linked together. So what happens is when you think about that memory, when you relive that memory, those associated emotions come up as well. So one of the things I always tell clients, one of the things I always tell people in general, is that if you have some traumatic thing that's happened in your life, don't just talk about it. Because every time you talk about it, every time you relive that memory, those associated emotions come up and it makes it even stronger. And it reinforces those emotions. It reinforces that experience, that negative experience. And therefore, when that comes up, it throws us, it puts us into what I call the void states. It puts us into often a very dysfunctional state. So don't just talk about it. So as a therapist, especially as a hypnotherapist, yes, in my sessions, I get people to talk about their traumatic events with the purpose of healing them. But if the person is just going to talk about them, then I generally, as in if I'm not doing an actual session with somebody, then I won't get them to talk about it in necessarily detail. What I normally say is talk about it without opening the box. In other words, talk about what's in the box. You can talk about, skirt around the memory, but without going deep into it. In other words, don't activate those emotions. That's very important. We don't want to keep talking about it and then reinforcing those negative emotions. Now, if we bring in some, those of you who like the science aspects or the biology aspects. So the brain has an alert system which is located in the amygdala part of the brain. So this is a pair of almond-shaped clusters of nuclei. And then what happens is after any emergency, the software in the amygdala is updated. And what it does is it registers what were the conditions surrounding that event? What was the conditions surrounding that trauma, that really bad thing that happened to us? And it takes note of that. And its programming is very simple. Never, ever let this happen again. The amygdala recognizes the patterns, the conditions, the situation that led up to this. And it's like, right, I'm never going to let this happen again. Which then leads us to act in certain ways. And I always make this point, emotions are not logical. Hopefully you can see why here. because when the amygdala gets activated, there's no logic involved. It just sees a situation, shuts down, and gets on with it. Like I had one client who went through a divorce, and she was so traumatized by her husband that he actually had so much of her gold, and she had to go collect it from him. And he made a condition that you have to see me, like as in you have to physically see me. I'm not going to give it to anybody. I want to make sure it's kind of recorded that here I've given you all the gold. She couldn't bring herself to go collect that gold, even though it's like thousands and thousands of pounds. So logically, does that make sense? No. But it's her amygdala protecting her, saying, I never want to be anywhere near this guy ever again. You see, so it overrides any logic. Now, one of the reasons why I'm explaining this is so that you can start to have a bit more understanding and compassion to yourself. So when you behave like that, when you behave totally illogically, understand this is the amygdala trying to protect you. So I'll give you some other examples. So one client, she was in a car accident when her dad was driving. So what happened was that developed within her the anxiety of driving by herself, because what if she crashes? And we worked through that, and I'm happy to say she is actually becoming more and more confident in driving by herself. It's wonderful. One client came to me, she had been through sexual abuse. So she had the anxiety of being intimate with her partner. So there were trust issues there, because having gone through that with a relative, having gone through sexual abuse with a relative, in other words, somebody who was trusted, now it makes it difficult for her to trust her husband. Another client went through a lot of verbal abuse. So it was always shouted at, it was always corrected, it was always criticized. This was not just by his mom, but also his siblings. And what happened was he started to develop this pressure of having to always be perfect. He had very high expectations on himself. And obviously having that high expectations means, and that constant pressure means, that he's always in anxiety. And what was really distressing for me was that even when he achieved that high, shall we say, very high standards on himself, there was no pleasure involved. Like I would tell him, like, wow, you've achieved this. And he'd just be like, yeah, thanks, Nij. I'm like, don't you feel anything? Like, aren't you excited? He's like, no. And the reason why is because it's almost like, because that's an expectation for him to have achieved it, it's normal. In other words, that's what he should have done, almost like that. So I really had to help him deal with that. And then another client was of a young girl. Sorry, she's not young anymore, but when she was young, her father left her. And what we've noticed is when I asked her about her relationships, she has a lot of anxiety in relationships. And what happens is any guy who tries to get close to her, she's an attractive lady, guys are interested in her, she gets into a relationship, and then due to fear of abandonment, due to the anxiety, the constant anxiety that she experiences while being in a romantic relationship, she can't sustain it. And she always tells the guy, before he breaks up with her, she says, I don't want to be with you anymore. And that constant fear is, that constant anxiety is there in the relationships because of a big T trauma. Her father left her. Now, one thing that I've observed, I found quite interesting, I'll share with you, is that I've noticed that a father can have a big impact on the daughter. And I've noticed the other way around as well, that the relationship that a man had with his mom has a big impact on his relationship with his wife. So if you are a parent, bear that in mind. We kind of discussed how traumatic events that happened to us in our past can lead to Anxiety in our relationships can lead to anxiety in terms of pressure that we put on ourselves, in terms of specifically, for example, driving. If somebody's been in a car accident, you can see how the anxiety that we experience is often linked to some event or events in the past. So perfectionism often stems from our parents criticizing us constantly and being put down. Whenever it's like we weren't allowed to make a mistake. So therefore, we internalize that voice or those voices. Even if our parents or our step parents are not with us, then what happens? That voice is still with us. That internalized voice is still with us and constantly pressurizing us to be perfect. And if there is somebody constantly pressurizing us or judging us, what happens? We then develop anxiety because we're constantly worrying, am I doing this? Am I doing this right? Am I doing this wrong? So now I wanted to discuss this concept of the inner child. So as a child, we're totally helpless. And at the same time, because we're helpless, we have a need for safety and comfort. We have a need to be soothed by our caregivers. For example, when a baby cries, sometimes it just wants to be held. Sometimes it doesn't want anything like it. It's not because it's cold or warm or, sorry, cold or hot, or it's hungry or something like that. Sometimes it just wants to feel loved. It just wants to be soothed. It just wants to feel safe. But what happens when that baby or that child doesn't get it? So these certain experiences, they may activate our nervous system. In other words, our nervous system gets switched on. And especially if this happens a lot, then what happens is our nervous system goes into a state of constant alertness to potential threats. Unfortunately, how many of us have experienced parents being in an environment where our parents were often arguing, and sometimes it was violent arguing. Some clients have said that due to alcohol or things like that, sometimes the father or whoever it was, the mother, would beat up the other parent. And then sometimes as a child, they would have to step in and stop whoever it is from practically killing the other parent. There's been cases like that. So when a young child goes through something like that, the nervous system then goes into this constant state of alertness to potential threats. And that continues. It becomes a conditioning of that nervous system. So now, even in adulthood, the person goes from 0 to 100 in an instant. The nervous system is wired for danger, which is not necessarily a good thing. Um, Especially if it's perceived threats. They're not actually now in a situation of danger. One client was telling me actually that sometimes when she's walking home from the tube station, she's constantly looking out that someone might attack her. Even though she's never had an issue while walking her entire life. She lives in London. She takes the tube to work sometimes and takes the tube and obviously walks from her house to the tube station and walks back. Never had an issue her entire life. But yet, when she gets out of the tube, her nervous system is constantly on threat alert. So luckily through trauma therapy, now that has started to subside. But that is that's the natural conditioning of the nervous system that was attacked as a child. And not because, and actually it was never somebody, shall we say, on the street. It was things that were happening at home or things that were happening at school. But then that's what puts the nervous system into that alert state. So if we look at that inner child, there were certain needs that weren't met. And as a result, there are survival mechanisms that we develop. And some of them are rooted in our nervous system, as I explained earlier. Some of those are rooted in the amygdala. So the default setting might be something like we're staying alert, we're on constant alert, high alert. The default setting could be we stay quiet. I'm going to talk about that in a little while. The default setting could be something like we're always expecting something to go wrong. It's horrible. So one client in particular, she told me this, one of her beliefs that are stopping her from getting into a relationship is that she's always expecting something is going to go wrong because what she's noticed in her life. Now, when I say she's noticed, this is her brain filtering this, by the way, because there's so many good things that have happened and that have stayed good. However, her brain is filtering to always look out for something that could go wrong. So when something good does happen and then it gets taken away, it's almost like a brain, see, and to um, almost like protect her or allowing her to be expectant that something will go wrong. Then what happens? She actually attracts it. So because she's always thinking, oh, what if this goes wrong? Oh, what if this goes wrong? What if this goes wrong? What if this goes wrong? So what happens? If that's what we're radiating, the universe responds. And so it does go wrong. That thing that is going right, then all of a sudden changes. So it has to be dealt with at the root, which is her inner child. And then another thing that often clients talk about, um, especially being in anxiety, is, or sorry, having an affinity for anxiety, is that they're always thinking 10 steps ahead. Now, why is that? So I wanted to just briefly explore that. Our inner child wants to be safe. So the reason, if you look at it, it's thinking, we're always thinking 10 steps ahead. So we're prepared for any threat. But the problem with that is it means we have to play out all the worst case scenarios. So if we want to be 10 steps ahead, if we want to um, understand what the potential threats could be all of the time, then it means we're playing out this scenario, this bad scenario. We're playing out this bad scenario. We're playing out the 10, whatever, bad scenarios that could happen. Now, what on earth will happen to your nervous system if you're constantly playing out all these bad scenarios? What's going to happen? We're going to activate the flight to fight response in our nervous system. Even though there's no threat, we're just sitting down in our chair, peacefully at home, but our mind is constantly thinking about all the worst case scenarios, all the worst case scenarios. What's happening to our body? What's happening to our system? What's happening to our nervous system? Immediately, it's getting activated. We're drowning almost in anxiety when actually we're totally safe just because we're playing out those scenarios. And one of the worst things is when we're doing it at work because we're afraid, oh, if I don't get this right, if I don't get that right, and we're playing out all the negative scenarios that the boss is going to do this, and ultimately the boss is going to fire me. And we almost um, work ourselves up into a frenzy, even though none of that is happening. The boss doesn't have a clue what's going on. So it's very important that we start to recognize these patterns. These patterns were generally created from our childhood because the nervous system was under attack. And the problem with always trying to be 10 steps ahead is now we're perpetuating that state of constant alertness. We're keeping our nervous system in that state of constant alertness. We don't want that. One other thing that I want to talk about just briefly. Next episode, we are going to talk about anger. So I'm going to talk about anger in detail, anger stemming from traumatic events. But I just wanted to mention and just kind of link the two. Sometimes anger could be the root of your anxiety. So when we have this default state of being agreeable, so in other words, in order to be safe, in order to keep ourselves safe, especially as a child, the inner child, to stay safe, it learnt to be agreeable. And that way, whether it's the parent, whether it's I don't know, a bully at school, whoever, whatever it learnt just to be agreeable in order to stay safe. That conditioning can later on cause a lot of trouble. So to stay safe, or i.e., to avoid getting hurt, the person learns just to say yes. The person doesn't express their needs, especially as a child, stays quiet. This can often lead to repressed anger because, so obviously, first of all, this is as a child and then leading into adulthood. So when somebody has got used to being agreeable, when somebody has got used to just saying yes because they don't want to get hurt, it almost becomes a conditioning. Now, when somebody is violating a boundary, they can't express it. So where does that anger go? Where does that anger from a boundary being violated? But they want to stay, they have to stay agreeable, so they're not going to express it. So it just immediately gets repressed. So the subconscious mind takes that anger and just hides it away quickly. And the person may not even be conscious of it. So how does your nervous system cope with that when there's so much unresolved anger? One symptom might be anxiety because there's all this anger bubbling away under the surface, and your nervous system doesn't know how to handle it. So it kind of, the symptom of that anger gets expressed as anxiety. So the reason why I'm sharing this with you is sometimes you need to introspect and actually understand is what is the root cause of this anxiety, whatever it is that you're going through. Actually, where does it really come from? And I was listening to one psychologist, and she was explaining that she was dealing with a lady who had anxiety after her third baby. So about 3 months after having that baby, she was going through a lot of anxiety. Came to this psychologist. She was exploring what was going on, and when they came to, I think she asked something along the lines of, um, did you want to have the baby? What came out was actually she didn't want to have the baby. The mom didn't, like, wasn't expecting to have a third child. And she was very angry at herself because she didn't want this actually. And she was especially actually angry at her husband, but she had never expressed it. And I assume one of the reasons why she didn't want to express it to anybody was because of the guilt. She didn't want the child to feel that it was unwanted. But that was what she was actually experiencing. But because that anger was repressed, it was showed up as anxiety. How do I handle this? So once she realized that, they were able to process the anger. The anxiety then went away because the anxiety was actually just a symptom of the root cause, which was the anger. So once you deal with the root cause, the symptom then goes away. Sometimes you might go through an emotion that comes up from the past. Now, I just want to share something with you. This is a lesson in one sense that doesn't just apply to anxiety. This is a lesson that applies to any emotion. When an emotion does surface from the past, the mind tries to justify the emotion with something from the present. Why? Because the emotion cannot live in a vacuum. There needs to be a reason for it. So, for example, one client was going through a lot of anxiety, and his mind actually made up a story. It completely cooked up this story in his head that some of his former schoolmates were after him, and they would come and attack his family, and he was going through this real deep anxiety. It's like churning of anxiety. He couldn't sleep. He was on constant high alert. Um, Eventually, he called me. He said, "Nij, like, I need to speak to you. Like, I can't sleep. I'm going through all of this." I was like, "What's up?" So when we discussed it, and I asked him, like, how long ago did you do that thing that they'll come out? Like, this was years ago. Have you been in touch with any of these school friends, school mates? Um, are they in touch with you? Have you seen them? Like, none of that for years. So then I explained this point to him that actually We are not the mind. Stop believing it. We are not our thoughts. Stop believing them in this case. And we're not our emotions in this case. Stop believing them. That none of these things are true. And what happens is, if we are too attached, if we really believe that our mind is the all in all, if we really believe that our thoughts and our emotions are the all in all, then we're in big trouble. Because our emotions and our thoughts and our mind goes through ups and downs all the time. This is why we suffer so much. The more attached we are to the mind, the more attached we are to our thoughts, that they're correct, that they're absolutely correct. The more attached we are to our emotions, that they're absolutely justified, the more we're going to suffer. So one of the spiritual teachings is about detachment, about detachment. Learn to become the observer of the mind. And that's one of the things we do in meditation. And we sit there and we just observe the thoughts. And you'll notice the thoughts are not us. Some thoughts, crazy thoughts, will just fleet. We'll kind of experience them and then it'll go. And it's the same with emotions. Sometimes emotions will come up that are not anything to do with the present. And when we are detached and we stay in the observer position, using logic, then we can figure that out. Sometimes we need somebody else to, like I said, somebody called me just to have that conversation, and I reassured him it's absolutely not true. And then he recognized it because he trusts me. We've had many sessions in the past. He recognized that and he was like, yeah, actually, you're right, Nij. So sometimes it requires somebody else to kind of point that out to us, point out for us something which is not obvious because you're in that emotion. So it's very important. Sometimes when you're in anxiety, the nervous system is just, shall we say, conditioned. It's just doing something to put you in a state of anxiety. But actually, the anxiety doesn't have any foundation in reality, in current reality. Sometimes it is just the conditioning from the past coming up. But our mind tries to almost trick us and tries to make us think about, oh, we haven't paid this bill, or this has happened, or so and so said this, that, and the other, and it brings up all this garbage, especially from the past. And this can even happen at like 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning. Have any of you had the experience where, I don't know, you're lying deep in sleep and all of a sudden your body will shock you? I don't know, you just have a thought and all of a sudden at 3 o'clock in the morning, you're wide awake and your mind has gone off into this spiral of, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And none of that is relevant in this moment in time at 3 a.m. So the mind is trying to create a justification for that emotion that you're going through. So be aware of that. And there are things you can do. So just to help you out, if that ever does happen 3 o'clock in the morning, one of the main things that you can do is just like put on some kind of hypnotherapy or meditation track and just get your mind just to switch off. Stop going through those crazy, crazy thoughts. You are not your thoughts. You are not your emotions, especially not in that moment. So how do we deal with this anxiety that is rooted in our inner child trauma? So if the root cause is because of the trauma of the inner child, then we need to heal the inner child and ask what needs weren't met of that inner child. What was the trauma that triggered the anxiety? What was the conditioning? What were the conditions that you went through that triggered that anxiety? And start to recognize that, acknowledge it, and understand it. And Carl Jung, he makes this point. We cannot change anything until we first accept it. We cannot change anything until we first accept it. The first stage is actually acceptance in the sense of understanding it, acknowledging it, and accepting, okay, this happened to me as a child. And this is the reason why why I behave this way. This is the reason for this conditioning. And like we were discussing, sometimes that conditioning is so automatic that there's no logic involved. And then we start beating ourselves up and we start saying, oh my God, why are you like this? Has anybody had the experience where they have a deadline And then the nervous system goes into this panic state. And then you start procrastinating. I know, you just start scrolling randomly. You start watching something on Amazon or Netflix, whatever it is. And it's like, hang on, there's a deadline. And then the deadline gets, it starts to loom a bit closer. And because the deadline's looming closer, your nervous system goes into more panic. And so you start procrastinating even more. Doesn't make sense. It's just the amygdala, it's just the nervous system trying to protect you, until eventually you get to the point where the deadline, where it's such a tight deadline, where then the rush of emotion comes up, like, oh my God, if I don't do this, I'm going to fail, or whatever it is. And then you manage to get over it. But now you've got very little time to do it. So you're rushing. Doesn't make logical sense. But we understand this is rooted in our trauma from the past. This is rooted with our inner child. The conditioning of the inner child, always being in a state of constant anxiety, and one of its default mechanisms to protect you is to avoid the very thing that actually you need to do in one sense. So introspection is required. What is that inner child lacking? And me and my assistant, we've developed a workbook, a PDF that you can use to help with actually doing the introspection. Some questions there, and you can go through that. If you go to www.nijdey.com/store, you'll find it there. Then we can analyze and ask ourselves, how are you feeling? And actually analyze the actual feeling. It's not just a general question, oh, how are you? It's actually, how are you feeling? What are the emotions that you're going through? And then sitting in meditation and giving your inner child that space to sit with those emotions. How are you feeling? Oh, I'm feeling like this. Okay, now sit with those emotions. Allow that inner child to experience and go through those emotions with you there. That's what it always wanted. It's called reparenting. It's like giving our inner child what our parents didn't give. Just to be clear, as I said in the previous episode, we don't blame our parents. Our parents, we take the line that our parents did the best that they could in their circumstance. However, we take responsibility for our healing. So if that means now I have to reparent my inner child, so be it. Now I'm going to be the best parent. What is it that child didn't get? What is it that will help soothe that inner child? What is it that will help them to feel safe, to feel comfortable, just being? And like I said, sometimes it means having to sit there and go through those emotions, allowing it to express those emotions, because it's never had somebody to express those emotions to. So often I will use hypnotherapy and I will take clients back in time, in one sense, to that point where that child needed those things, and then we give that child the time and the attention to actually express itself and heal and express those emotions and feel those emotions, and I can see the result afterwards, how then that client just advances in whatever thing that they're trying to do. The anxiety goes down, the anger goes down, whatever emotion it is. It's very powerful. And then another really important point is to allow yourself to cry rather than just swallow the emotions. How many times has emotion come up and rather than crying, we've distracted ourselves, doom scrolling, or watch a movie or do something else? No, sometimes you just need to sit with that emotion, just cry it out. It's really important. And I'll especially say this to the men. Women generally are more, shall we say, open to crying, but the men, especially British men, often brought up with this idea that, oh, hard men don't cry, men don't cry, they're hard. And that's one of the factors I've heard, that's one of the factors why men actually die earlier than women, is because they bottle up all their emotions and eventually the body just can't take it anymore. So it leads to diseases, heart problems, and so many other things that cause the body ultimately to deteriorate. So expressing emotions is actually really important. And I only learned that in my 20s, much later on. And then dealing with anxiety. So one key um, mechanism that, in one sense, you need to train yourself to do is to pause before you react. How many times has, I don't know, you've read a text, um, read an email, or somebody said something to you on the phone, and we just react, we just explode, we just, that whatever emotion it is just comes out. So actually learning to pause before we react, really important. And notice any tension in your body. Ask, what do you need to do right now? What do you need from yourself right now? So rather than judging or criticizing yourself, actually to be gentle. This judging and criticizing, where does it come from? It's not necessarily a default state. It often comes from our caregivers, like I said, bullies at school, teachers, whoever it was, that kind of taught us that this constant like assessing, have I done this right? Have I done this right? And it needs to be perfect. No, it doesn't need to be perfect. None of us are perfect. So learning to be more gentle with ourselves, learning to be gentle with that inner child, because it didn't have that. And if your nervous system is activated, learn to soothe it. Again, how can we berate ourselves that we don't do something that we never we were never taught to do? If our parents didn't actually teach us, actually didn't soothe us, how would we know how to do that? So we now have to reparent ourselves, reparent that inner child, and learn to do that for ourselves, learn to give that to ourselves. So one last thing I'll say, just in terms of releasing those emotions, what we'll say is that I use the process of hypnotherapy. I like that a lot. I feel it's a very powerful tool. And one of the things it allows us to do is, as I was saying earlier, right at the beginning, that when there's a traumatic event, there's a memory of that event that gets stored, and then the associated emotions with that memory also get stored. So through hypnotherapy, what we're able to do is we're able to remove or reduce the intensity of those emotions associated with the memory. So now what happens is you can talk about that memory without getting triggered. You can still have the memory of it if you want to. Sometimes we even delete the memory, but we don't always need to do that. But through hypnotherapy, we can actually reduce or remove altogether the intensity of those emotions. So now you have the memory. You can talk about what happened as a child. I have one client, she went through a lot of school bullying. And now when people at work talk to her about them getting bullied, it doesn't trigger her anymore. It used to. If they would talk about it, immediately all these negative emotions will come because it's re-triggering that memory and the associated emotions. But now they're not there anymore. And so she's fine. She tells them about her past experiences and she helps them through it. It's wonderful. So here are some concluding words. I just wanted to share with you some things that you could say that your inner child longs to hear. Just share these 7 phrases your inner child longs to hear. So if you want to, you can close your eyes and just reconnect with that inner child wanting to hear these things. So one of them is, I love you. How often did the inner child hear those words, especially from those that it wanted to hear it from? I believe in you. I'm proud of you. I see you. I hear you. I feel you. I feel what you're going through. You belong. That feeling of safety, feeling of belonging, feeling almost like you have a right to be. You are safe. Tell your inner child that. One of the reasons why anxiety is triggered is because it doesn't feel safe. You are safe. And a really important one, especially to stop putting pressure on ourselves unnecessarily. You are enough. You are enough. And finally, you are forgiven. We all make mistakes. We're all human. If we were perfect, we wouldn't be in this world. So, we're allowed to make mistakes. You are forgiven. Okay, in case your eyes are closed, you can open them again.
In this episode, Nij Dey talks about how anxiety and panic attacks often trace back to unresolved trauma from the past, and how understanding these roots can help you begin to calm your body and mind. In the next episode, we'll explore how trauma can also lead to intense anger and rage, and what you can do to start breaking free from those patterns. Like and subscribe for more insights on healing, self-awareness, and emotional mastery.